Today is Friday, December 22nd, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here, as always, with my podcast partner, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Wallace Smith, how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I have my second cup of coffee on the table. I'm quite caffeinated, doing very well.
I appreciated you also bringing me some coffee, and I needed the extra boost today.
You're welcome.
But that's not all. We are also here with a very special guest, a man sometimes known as a friend of the podcast, pastoring 4 churches in Northern Ohio, Mr. Phil Sena. How are you doing, Mr. Sena?
I'm doing fine, but I didn't get any coffee.
You know, that's true, and I thought of that as the words were coming out of my mouth. But to his credit, Mr. Robinson asked me for coffee, and you got to knock. You got to knock. Or no, that's right. You got to seek.
Yeah. Okay, I'll know next time.
You'll know next time.
Mr. Smith, what is our topic for today?
Our topic today, and actually, let me give props to Mr. Sena. I think he recommended the topic. Didn't you recommend the topic?
It's from the list.
I think you did.
We
have
Mr.
a list.
Sena what if there's something in a topic he would like to cover, and we shared with him our list of the many requests, and he chose.
And it chose this one, we were happy about it. We are going to discuss how to honor your parents. Welcome back. And not only today are we going to talk about how to honor your parents, but we're going to focus ourselves on 3 ways to honor your parents. You know, I have to admit, before we get into it, I'm a little jealous. I hope it's not inappropriately jealous, or not jealous is the wrong word, envious. But we kind of planned on getting started early here, and we're now 40 plus minutes and not just now getting started. But hearing Mr. Sena and Mr. Robinson chat about good old days that I had nothing to do with as they knew each other, I am a little envious, you guys, just so you know, because I appreciate both of you so much, and you're good friends, and I appreciate the history. Among them, Mr. Sena being such a good mentor in terms of speaking and such.
I look back on that time period very fondly. The whole thing, not just Mr. Sena, our life there. I mean, there were some struggles financially back then, but we had a great time living in Austin back then. And Mr. Sena was a fantastic pastor and helped me a lot.
And I appreciated too. He'd been in the field longer than I, and had given some advice about training sermonette guys. That I didn't do it exactly the way he did, because of course I was going to make it better, but I did do it. But I did appreciate it and used as much of those techniques. And among them, he suggested today to help us sharpen our focus, which I've already ruined a bit by going into other things. But sharpen our focus to not just talk broadly about how to honor your parents, but we're going to focus on 3 specific things you can do. Mr. Sena, thank you for sharpening us. And then afterwards, we might broaden the question a bit, because some of you might think, I'm not a teenager anymore, as some of our listeners are, but, I'm a young adult. I've actually got my own family now. I've got a marriage now. Maybe I've got young kids. How does that shift there? So we're going to talk about 3 ways to honor your parents, but then stay tuned if you feel they don't apply to you as well as you think they might. I do think some of them will definitely still apply. I got to admit, I can't remember exactly what they're going to say, but definitely we'll cover that question also here at the end. So, gentlemen, we haven't talked about any particular order or anything. Who's going first?
I think we should have Mr. Sena go first, because his is more foundational, I think, for the topic.
Okay.
That sounds great.
All right. Well, I'll start then, because I think this is, like Mr. Robinson said, foundational to the rest of what we're going to talk about. And that is, one way that we can honor our parents is to actively focus on what you respect about your parents. Actively focus on what you respect about your parents, because too often we focus on our parents' shortcomings. It's natural to do that. And yes, our parents have flaws, as do all humans. However, we should choose, and I think that's the key, is to choose to focus on our parents' positive traits, because they have those as well. Focusing on the negative leads to disrespect and cynicism and bitterness, and it can definitely affect your relationship with your parents, and you want to avoid that. You want to do what God wants you to do, and you want to have good relationships with everyone, but especially with your parents, because this is a very, very important relationship that you'll have your entire life. And if you allow the disrespect and the bitterness to grow, it's a downward spiral that tends to get worse over time. And so I think it's something that as a young person, you decide now to focus on the good things, on what you do appreciate and respect about your parents. And the reason I thought of this point to focus on the positive is because I remember a time when I was an older teen that I was losing respect for my father. And the reason I was losing respect for him is because he wasn't a spiritual giant. And that's what I thought he should be, because the reason I felt that way is because I read scriptures about how husbands and fathers should be. Scriptures such as Genesis 18 and verse 19, where it says about Abraham, "For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they should keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham at what he has spoken to him." Genesis 18:19. And that's the ideal. And Abraham's the father of the faithful, and definitely a giant, even spiritual giant. And so that, though, was the ideal that I wanted for my father. And I was comparing my dad to this ideal of a spiritually mature man who reflected Jesus Christ, and thought my dad just wasn't cutting it. And I realize now that I was being completely unfair and unrealistic about my father. But I believe a lot of people expect those in the church to have no flaws, and especially our parents, because we read scriptures like this and we think, well, that's what our parents should be like. But my attitude changed toward my dad one day when I had an opportunity to watch him work. My dad operated heavy equipment at a coal strip mine in Colorado. And I don't remember why I had the opportunity to watch, because it was usually a restricted site due to the size of the equipment that they were operating. And these were massive machines that required incredible skill to operate. And I watched my dad run an enormous rubber tire dozer, a bulldozer, among gigantic scrapers and dump trucks and a drag line. And as I was watching him and the skill that it took to do that and how large these machines were, all I could think of was, wow, wow, that's amazing. And watching my dad in the context of his world gave me a whole new appreciation for his talents and abilities that gave me a better appreciation and perspective of him as a person. And more importantly, it helped me to respect him for who he was, not who I wanted or expected him to be. And this experience helped me to focus more on what I respected about my parents, and I had to have more realistic expectations of them, and to keep in mind who they were, their backgrounds, and what made them what they were. And that, for them, they were great people and wonderful people. And this helped me to enjoy them more and just accept who they were, which helped me to have a better relationship with them. And I started to grow in my respect for my dad. And the fact is, our parents have characteristics for which to respect, all of them. Once I was less judgmental and more accepting of my parents, I started to see so many excellent qualities in them. It was a change in the way I looked at things and my perspective that changed it, though. They didn't change at all. They still had those qualities and everything, and they still had the flaws. But my focus was more on who they were and appreciating that. And this is much healthier perspective than what I had before, and it's helped me to maintain a good relationship with them ever since. Because even through events such as them staying in the Worldwide Church of God and eventually going to a Protestant church, we've still maintained a good relationship through all of those things. And my dad is now 94 years old, still living, still doing well, in good health, and my mother is 89. And so I still have them, and I still have an opportunity to have a relationship with them, which I'm so blessed to have. And I only have good feelings and memories of my parents, and I tell them often how much I love and appreciate them, and so appreciative to God for them being my parents. And I thank Him almost every day for the blessing of them being my parents. And so for all of us, I suggest, instead of being frustrated by your parents' limitations, actively focus on what you respect about your parents. And I believe this helps us to honor our parents as God wants us to. But I also suggest going further and actually tell your parents what you respect about them. Because if you tell them, this will not only probably blow them away, but it will also encourage them as well. Because it's hard being a parent, as we all know. Being parents, it's not an easy job, and there are so many things that we wish we could change, wish that we could do better, wish that we could go back and do things, redo things than what we did, how we did handle them, and we continue to make mistakes. But to hear encouragement from our kids for what they appreciate about us is so helpful to us. But it also benefits you as their child, because before you can tell them, you first have to meditate on what you appreciate. You have to really think it through, which leads to formulating organized thoughts. And instead of just being this ambiguous idea flowing in your head that, yeah, I love my parents and I respect them. No, to really think it through and organize your thoughts as to what you do appreciate about them and respect about them, it becomes more concrete and it becomes more real to you and specific. And it's one of the reasons why prayer is good for us, because that's basically what we do with God, is we organize our thoughts in order to talk to Him. And so to help organize our thoughts with our parents about what you respect about them, it may be helpful to first write a list of what you do appreciate about them, and write down specific traits that you appreciate, but also include specific deeds or sacrifices your parents have done that you respect or admire. And these deeds and sacrifices don't have to be just for you. They can be what they've done for your siblings or other people, just things, all these other things that they have done and who they are that you can appreciate and respect. And so my point, and one way to honor your parents, is to focus on what you respect about your parents. And I'm sure there are many things that you can focus on that will help improve your relationship with them, and you can honor them in the process.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Sena. You know what that reminds me of? And maybe we should read this here at the beginning. Maybe we should have even started this way, that why even honor your parents at all? Well, the very least, God does command us. Exodus 20 and verse 12, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the eternal your God is giving you. But part of what I appreciate about what you just said, and I knew he was going to say something like this. I didn't, just so you know, we have our show prep. We do try to be organized here, Mr. Sena. But, all the comments that you made, they remind me of the fact that, honor your father and mother as a command, like what we're told for husbands and wives when you're older in Ephesians chapter 5. Husbands, love your wives, and wives, respect your husbands, and how those are also commands. It doesn't say love your wife unless she's just not lovable, or respect your husband unless he's just not respectable. No, it's actually a command, and then the onus is on us as the other spouse to find ways to obey that command in every circumstance. And one of the advice we often give is, for your wife, don't just focus on the things that are hard to love, because guess what? You've got those too. Focus on those other things. And same thing for a wife. Yes, sometimes your husband clips his toenails in bed and it's uncomfortable, because you wake up and, oh, great, I got a, toenail.
That's a disgusting habit.
That's disgusting. Yeah, don't do that. And you can lose respect for that. However, don't focus on those things. Focus on the things you actually respect about the person, and do the same thing with your parents. This is going to be a shock to both of you, but unlike, Mr. Robinson, for instance, Mr. Robinson is a perfect dad. I'm not. I know if I asked Mr. Robinson's daughters, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, father,
Yeah,
Papa
what's
has
one thing he did wrong? Man, I just can't
nothing,
come up with anything.
Nothing, But my kids would surely have a list, and I know I have a list for my parents, things that were frustrating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think of my kids, and you hope that you're not just filling their life with frustration, but that hopefully they see things you tried to do that maybe you don't even notice. But it has gotten me reflecting on my mother and father. And boy, I'm so glad yours are so long-lived, Mr. Sena, because mine are not. Both of mine died in their early 70s. And as I've gotten older, first when God started opening my mind to truths, because none of my family's in the church, And when God started opening my mind to truths about how to even be a mom and dad, it really helped me to orient myself. Well, hey, here's the things I don't want to do, perhaps that my father did, or here's, and as you start to see those things. But then as I've gone on, even some of the difficulties that mom and dad overcame, and some of the personality difficulties they had that they had to do differently to be a mom or dad. And then even some of the struggles that I might have blamed them for in the past, that now that I'm their age, I see that, well, actually I inherited, and I have this similar struggle. And I've come to respect them in a different way and to think more in terms of not what I overcame that was a problem, say just pick my dad, but actually things that my dad exhibited that I recognize, man, if I had not seen that example in his life, I would be a different person. I would not be the same. But I can't tell him. I'll have to wait until the second resurrection to be able to tell him that. And so I like that, remembering it is a command to honor them. And so how do you keep any command? You focus yourself on, well, then how do I do that? And making a list of those things that we really respect about our parents and appreciate about our parents, to remind ourselves of that. It just sounds like wonderful advice. So thank you.
There's another scripture that I think goes with this as well, as Leviticus 19 and verse 3. Leviticus 19 and verse 3, where it says, every one of you shall revere. And it's interesting. It says his mother first and his father. So
interesting.
That's an interesting point that's brought out there. And keep my Sabbaths, because I am the Lord your God. So obviously that's the explanation point.
Right.
Because God is the one who instituted these things. But that word revere in other translations is translated respect. Every one of you shall respect his mother and father, which if you take that as a command, which I believe it is, then, and that's the thing about these commands, is they're what we can control. It's what we are expected to do. It's what God expects of us as an individual to do with our mother and father. And so I think that scripture goes with that as well.
If I can say one technical thing before we move on, I want to apologize to any of our listeners if sometime during Mr. Sena's answer it sounded like Godzilla was stomping around here or something. Mr. Robinson and I were looking at each other. It sounded like they're trying to move 18 refrigerators outside the door here. So if you didn't hear that, then just be thankful we have such fantastic microphones that are so directional, because it was actually pretty loud. So, Mr. Robinson, I don't know if you have any more comment or
well, I mean,
want to move to the second point.
We could just spend the rest of the podcast talking about this. When I just listening to you, and I knew in general what you were going to talk about, of course, but not in detail, is it triggered several thoughts with me. And one I won't belabor was I thought the same thing about, I went to my marriage.
You did too.
And my wife, but the first one was, right, this makes sense. It's so fundamental, because if you don't learn respect at a very young age for your parents, that is going to be a problem for you your entire life. And then pretty soon you're struggling with authority in general. You think your boss is an idiot and you don't respect him. And you know what? Maybe he's not a great boss. But, living your life not respecting people, or not honoring people who've had a certain number of life experiences and are older than you and maybe know more than you think. You just think that they don't know. And then all the way down to the ministry. If you don't fundamentally respect your mother and your father, who are you going to respect? And ministers, but other than Mr. Sena, ministers make mistakes, and or we think they make mistakes, and really we just don't agree with how they handled something. And most of the time it's because we don't have all the facts. That's a different podcast. But anyway, how foundational this is, and I like the scriptural support of this is actually Abraham, the father of the faithful, right? Fundamental to him, because a lot of these other patriarchs were not great fathers. Mm-hmm. But Abraham is lauded for that, and it was a big deal. And so, it's Abraham as the father of us all, in that sense, is why? Because he instructed his kids and brought them up. But anyway, that's one of the things I thought about. And I did think about how easy it is. My wife and I had pretty clearly defined roles. She worked the first few years we were married, but once we had kids, she's been stay-at-home wife and caretaker. And I realized after about 15 years, I came home and I didn't view it as being critical, mm-hmm. but I would I would come home and maybe the house isn't exactly the way I wanted, or dinner's behind schedule, and I would say something critical about it. I didn't think about it, and over time I realized no, that wasn't good, and I needed to ignore. So this is what the thing that you said that I thought about. You know what I did when I wanted to fix that? I ignored everything that bothered me and only looked for things that were positive, and then I could say something positive. It'd be like, "Oh, babe, that." That's how I would say it. Babe, that dinner smells so good. I can't wait to have it, or whatever. And it's funny the way things went from then on out, when I consciously suppressed the negative and consciously focused on the positive, was transformative.
Yes.
And,
Wow.
and my wife felt much more valued and appreciated. And then guess what? All the little things I wish she just did on her own, because she felt valued and appreciated. And I would see, you could see how that would apply to your parents as well. And then your parents already want to do, the average parent wants to help you and make your life better and everything. All the more if you actually appreciated what they did for you.
And actually tell them. I think that's
Yeah.
important. One thing that I wanted to bring up with the point that you made about learning how to respect authority in the home with following this command benefits you the rest of your life is brought out by Mr. Meredith in the Ten Commandments booklet in the 5th commandment chapter.
Okay.
Believe it or not.
Go figure.
Pages 33 and 34 in the booklet, it says, this is quoting Mr. Meredith, it says, the remarkable answer to juvenile problems goes deeper than might be realized, for it goes to the very source of the problem, a lack of deep-seated respect for authority, beginning in infancy and continuing throughout life. And then he goes on to say, the home and the family unit are the basis of all decent society, and the relationship of children to their parents is an exact type of the spiritual relationship between true Christians and God. The lessons of character learned in that relationship may last children the rest of their lives and for eternity. And so, yes, it's more than just the relationship you have with your parents that you're learning. And I believe this is one of the reasons why God gives us this command, is so that we will learn to respect authority, all authority, for all eternity.
One of the other ministers I heard bring that out real strongly, and I mentioned in our discussion before we started recording, was way back at a camp. Mr. Jonathan McNair highlighted that, and he used 1 Timothy 5, where Paul is trying to instruct Timothy about how to deal with other people in the congregation. And what does he tell Timothy? In 1 Timothy 5, verse 1, he says, do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters, with all purity. And he emphasized that really exactly what you're saying, Mr. Sena, and what Dr. Meredith has highlighted here. The family is the place where we really learn how to interact with all the various relationships in our lives. And that includes authority. And you've highlighted in the notes how Romans 13:1 highlights that God does put authorities in our life, not just mom and dad. There are a lot of authorities in our life, and God does designate authorities in our lives. And how we deal with those, we've learned from how we deal with mom and dad. And like Mr. Robinson, you said earlier, if you don't learn that early on, it's painful, because it doesn't change the fact that there are still authorities in your life. I remember a church member a long time ago, really nice guy. I do miss him, but I remember him after a sermon I gave, he turned around and told me straight to my face, I need to let you know I have a problem with authority. And I was like, well, thanks for being up front. I sure appreciate it. But he at least he recognized that, at least it was a recognition, and he saw that as an issue. And yeah, if you don't learn it, which actually we have young parents there, and let me just say one quick thing to our young parents who are listening, because we've mentioned it in a few sermons too. I know it is crucial that you not allow your children to grow up not honoring you. That it may seem weird that you have to impress upon some other human beings that they've got to honor you. It sounds self-centered. It is one of the least self-centered things you can do for that child. You must teach those children to respect that you are their mother and their father, and that they owe you a certain respect. And not only will you personally reap the rewards of that, as they're getting older, as I know with my boys, they're way too big and old for me to spank at this point. They could easily push me over and say, hey, Dad, guess what? It's your spanking day.
Wait, are you officially the Shortest member of your family. You know?
No, my mother-in-law is shorter than I am. However, it's more than just you reaping the rewards of children who have a right relationship with you. They will reap the rewards for decades, even after your demise, of having a right relationship with others in their life because you have taught them that. So yeah, we're talking about how to honor your parents, but it's not really fundamentally just about your parents. It's about a broad world of relationships for them. So the next two items, Mr. Robinson, see what you think. Yours, I think, kind of expands it in a very important way. Mine is kind of small.
No, I think
go
we
second.
should,
You think?
Okay, I was about to say something you mentioned to me would naturally lead into what I think the point is that you're trying to make.
Oh, okay.
Because the scripture you just read talked about exhorting an older man. And
okay.
since I grew up, was born into the Worldwide Church of God, we had a very strong tradition that you always called any adult Mr. and Mrs. And it was so deeply embedded in us that I remember one time I don't remember where I was, but we're in our 30s and we have kids, and my wife is still calling everybody Mr. and Mrs. everything. Even people, and I appreciated that, but that's how deeply ingrained it was. I think this is the direction you're going with this, but like, how important is just simple, respectful things like that?
Oh, you're right. Okay, so that we'll do that then. So that was my point. We're each offering a point, and my recommendation about how to honor your parents is very simply, I like it personally because I feel it's super practical. Learn to speak to your parents in a respectful manner. Never be too I'd say too casual with it. They are your parents. I mean, you have to be casual in your moments, but still watch your language. Say sir, say ma'am. Use those honorifics, as they can be called when addressing them. If your dad asks you to mow the lawn, and then say yes, sir. Just say, hey, so and so, could you give me that? Yeah. Don't just throw a yeah out. I mean, maybe your mom and dad are used to hearing that, but learn to step up your game and actually throw out that sir and throw out that ma'am. I think it's large. I remember my mom teaching me. Based on, she heard once there was let's say in her in-laws side of the family, there was an uncle that was not very well respected. And he wasn't actually, I say a great uncle. He was kind of distant. And so they almost never saw him, and his life was pretty messed up. And so they just didn't see him much. And so some of the family members in the extended family would refer to him by his first name. He wouldn't be Uncle so-and-so or Great Uncle so-and-so. It'd be such and such. And I remember my mother taking me aside because I didn't even know who this person was. He was never a part of our lives. But she used it as an opportunity. She didn't just explain who he was, but she highlighted, without disrespecting the other side of the family, she said, but, Wally, I want you to know, if it's your uncle, you always call them Uncle so-and-so. If it's your aunt, you always call them Aunt so-and-so. That's the position they are in your family, and that should be honored with those things. And boy, I always appreciated that. And so even when the kids were growing up, we had some friends in the church, the congregation, and the kids were very little, and they would call everyone Mr. and Mrs. because everyone is an adult to them. No one is their peer in that sense. Everyone is an adult, and we taught them. You call them Mr. and Miss or Mrs. And I remember there was one couple. I love them very much. I hadn't seen them in a long time, but they just didn't like that. They said, "Oh no, have them call us," and they wanted our kids to call them by their first names. And I explained. I said, I'm never going to do that. I mean, when they're adults and they're talking with you, they can work out some kind of relationship. But honestly, they're probably like me. It's always going to be Mr. and Mrs. because it's just you. Then you're an elder. You're kind of older. I don't mean ordained elder. But they really pressed, almost like it got to a point where it felt offensive to them. It was very strange. And I thought, well, I'm not going to compromise because I feel it's too important for my children's formation. And in that particular case, they were close enough that I held out an olive branch for uncle and aunt because they some kind of honorific where it's not just, I'm going to make up the names. Hey, Bob and Jane. It's not Bob and Jane. And they liked that. Like, oh no, we could do that. And I knew the kids loved them enough that would feel pretty comfortable. And so they have had like a few non-family members, not many, but they were close enough to them that they would call, that was part of our agreement, they would call them uncle and aunt. But I refuse to have my children call other adults by their first name. Well, all the more your mom and dad. I hope no one's calling their mom and dad by their first name. That would just, don't do that, right? It's treating that relationship as something less. It's treating that relationship as if it's not your father or mother. They're in an honored position. And so I would encourage you, and I'll take it to a different level in just a moment, but try to learn to practice all the things that you hear are good manners. If anyone on earth should hear those kind of good manners from you, it's your mother and father. Respond with a sir, respond with a ma'am, respond with a thank you. Even when they're doing something they do every day that you kind of start to take for granted, because it's easy to take for granted. I know I definitely took things for granted that my mother did. Still, try to put in those thank yous and speak to them in an honorable way. But let me go one step further, and this can be a challenge. And I've been a bit open on the podcast. None of my family was called that I know of. None of them certainly attended, and so definitely there were some challenges. There's things we didn't understand. Mr. Sena just talked a bit about his family, but notice the honorable way in which he spoke of his father. And I'd encourage us to do that, even when we're speaking about our parents in other environments where they're not around. Hold them up honorably. You don't use talking to someone else as an opportunity to just completely run them down. Now, let me qualify that. For instance, in the field as a pastor, sometimes I've had wives who want to counsel about their husband, or they want to come, they have a question, and it's different to have, say, a wife come and she just wants to rail about her husband, or something like that, versus one who is still trying to honor the fact that this is their husband, but yet they're seeking sincere counsel because they don't know what to do. None of us, because even my kids don't have perfect parents, right? We talk about that. And sometimes maybe you do want a little counsel. Maybe you're an older teen and you're having a hard time figuring out how to, like if I had grown up in the church, I only came in when I was 18, but if I had come in a little bit earlier, I would be needing a little help. There were some circumstances there that were difficult that I'd have to understand. Well, how do I respect so-and-so, and how do I honor my parents? And so we're not talking about living in a fantasy land where reality isn't reality. That can depress you. That sometimes, like, there are cases out there where parents are just straight up abusive, for instance, and then we're not trying to pretend that's not the case. But that honoring your parent doesn't mean, well, I guess I need to just absolutely allow this person to abuse me. At the same time, they're not honoring themselves in that circumstance, but that's when you can go and get help from a qualified person. It doesn't mean running them down every place you go, but when you're working with your confidant, another adult, that you can talk to in your family, or a minister. Again, if you're listening to this, you should be in the Living Church of God. You can talk with your minister. But there's an attitude, that's what I'm trying to get across, that even in these difficult circumstances, there's an attitude you can have where even when you're seeking counsel about something, you're not looking for an opportunity to harp or to denigrate or just to feel the satisfaction that comes with running someone down. Yeah. And let me be upfront. If you don't think that's satisfying, I can speak carnally from my time in the world. It is. Me and my friends were like the cut down kings, and there is something that feels good about running down someone else, especially if that person is a source of irritation or frustration. And that's a devilish mentality. You don't want to get into that. And so even in the most difficult of circumstances, there's a difference between looking for an opportunity to just dishonor someone versus actually seeking counsel and seeking the opportunity to share with someone, a difficulty and a burden, so they help you bear under a burden in some cases. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to be too vague.
Yes. You as you were going through that, who popped into my mind? Mary and Joseph. Joseph is betrothed to Mary, finds out his fiancée is pregnant. That's not going to go over well, right?
Right.
Until it gets explained to him. But it makes it clear in the scriptures that he was going to quietly put her away.
Oh, great example.
And he
Mr.
could have
Robinson
gone around town saying, do you know what happened to my fiancée?
Absolutely. And make sure he got good social support, because people might think that I've been messing around. Right. I don't want to think that. Next thing you know, he's spreading word. But no, you're right. He tried to show her as much honor as he could in that circumstance. When a lot of people these days, there'd be a TikTok video about it. I can't believe my woman. What's going on? That's my attempt at a TikToker. I don't know. They sound.
That's good.
Okay. Well, thank you. Anyway, that was my point. I find that it's worth paying attention to the words that come out of your mouth, because Jesus Christ says it's out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. And you might say, what difference does it make saying sir and ma'am and things like that? Well, in terms of the way the air vibrates when you say the word, yeah, probably nothing. But what it does show is what's in your heart. And if we are tending to the words of our mouth, it kind of has this kind of reverse effect. If it's important enough to me to think about how I say it, what does that mean? It means it's becoming important to me. If it's important to me to just monitor how I say it, that's a sign it's actually becoming important to me. So I would say tend to the words of your mouth and try to speak to your parents in an honorable and respectful way, and go out of your way to do so.
I would just add to that I think that the benefit for doing that is for the person who's actually saying the words, as probably more than for the person, because the person, like your parents, they're not doing it to inflate themselves, or they shouldn't anyway, that they're requiring that of you, but you're doing it because it changes your heart. It changes the way you view them, and you have a much more respectful way of thinking of them and talking to them and everything. So it helps you, and I think that's another benefit, a great benefit for doing that.
And this might be a segue into what I believe is Mr. Robinson's point, because what you just said reminded me of a sermon I heard a long time ago in Dallas, where someone's bringing up the point about God, saying, why does God essentially command us to praise him and to honor him? And why are there beings in heaven that we read are constantly praising God? That means he had to create them. And is it because God is just egotistical and he needs praise all the time, like some weird Star Trek deity that will shrink if somehow he's not praised? No, God, in the end, what does God want? He wants us and his family. He wants us transformed to be like him, to be selfless, so he can glorify us. And so if he's commanding us to give him due honor and praise, it's not because he needs it. He will be neither greater nor lesser for the sake of our praise. It's because it's transformative for us. It's transformative for us to praise God. And the individual who was giving that sermon, again, many years ago, he highlighted that we tend to want to become like those things we set in high regard. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the guy who dreams of being a basketball star and has a giant LeBron James poster, in his room or in his gym locker, whatever it is, we tend to want to become like those things that we hold up for high praise and honor. And in that sense, that's why God wants us to do that. He wants us to honor him, not because he needs it, but because it transforms us. And in this way, just like you're saying, if you take the time to obey God and to think about it, to not do it to not just do what comes lazy or easy, but to think about it and examine yourself. How do I honor my parents more? Why? I can speak about them differently. I can talk to them differently. It does have a transforming effect on you. Not that they wouldn't appreciate it, but it does. And Ms. Robinson, is that a segue to what you're going to say?
I think so.
All right.
It's funny because you actually trigger one of my favorite other topics that it's one of my earlier sermons I ever did, because the God is quite clear throughout the Bible, continuously from Genesis to Revelation, of how problematic idols are. Okay, and so like just on the surface you kind of get it, right? But I'm like, no, what's like the deeper thing? And there's a psalm in there that says, those who make idols become like their idols. Like you said, and I use the example I tend to use for the sports guy is Michael Jordan, more of a generational thing. And I think when he came into the league, there was something like 8 or 9 guys that had their head shaved, and Michael Jordan had his head shaved. Like 2 or 3 years later, as he was clearly the best player in the league, there was like 80% of the league had their hair shaved, right? And as a kid, I had Nike Air Jordans, and I wanted to play basketball like him. And so that's why our focus needs to be on God the Father ultimately. And so the thing that I was going to bring out today is that the command honor your father and mother, I think very clearly also would point to God the Father. I mean, that is his title. And ultimately, one of the things I was going to emphasize with the youth, specifically the teens and getting into your early 20s, is one of the ways we can honor our parents is by forging a relationship with God the Father. There was, my top 5 most rewarding things I've ever done in my life. One of them was watching Maddie get baptized. It actually makes me emotional even thinking about it right now. But because when we're in the church, we understand how critically important that is, but we can't do that for them, and they need to focus. And
Right.
so, but then also and then I'll say this other thing, because this forks here for me. This also puts some burden on the parents, in my opinion. A small child to us, a newborn. I mean, I could see the way, because I was really focused in on my kids when I had them. And Maddie, she's the first one, right? So everything's brand new. Man, she just looked up to you like you were. It's just so it doesn't sound like it's blasphemous. In Exodus, God talks about Abraham being like God to Aaron as his prophet,
Or Moses, right?
Moses. No, thank you. Your kids look up to you in a godlike way when they're very little, and why wouldn't they? You're huge and powerful and strong, and you protect them and you save them, and that's their first introduction to really the idea of God the Father later in their life. One of the things I've learned, I can't say I've really studied it, but a lot of the stuff I listen to will talk about child development, and we underestimate how much our children from a very, very young age are keenly observing us, and they are watching what we do and how we pattern our lives. And they are forming their understanding of what's important based on our behavior. And how little kids, they point to things. That is actually a critical formulative thing where they're pointing to what this is important, and that's part of our job. So to me, it's a kind of a twofold thing. We want our kids to go on and form their own relationship with God the Father, but that starts with the example that we're modeling. That's the first thing they see.
Wow.
That's all excellent.
Should we just conclude the podcast there?
Okay, that's a good point. Those. Thank you, Mr. Robinson. I think that is a very good point. And my parents weren't in the church. I bring that up, but I don't think it's any different, because I like to think that when my mother and father come up in the second resurrection, and when my grandfather and grandmother, both sets, come up, because my paternal grandfather was an elder in his church, and it was sincere. He was known as a real humble guy. It was important to him. Of course, it wasn't the truth. He didn't know the full truth, but they're not going to know what I did in this life until they come up again. But if I do honor God and put Him first, what an honor it'll be to them that hopefully their influence on me helped in this regard. Or if I don't, what a tragedy it's going to be for them to discover that that I had an opportunity to be a part of this and didn't, and how difficult that will be. And the idea of actually honoring your parents by honoring God, I think it's remarkable. I think the last thing, and we do have time, Mr. Sena, you're helping us do a tighter program. We appreciate it. You're such a good influence on us.
It's my goal. It's why I'm here.
So we talk about Mr. Sena is a friend of the podcast, but we also highlighted that, as we actually say multiple times in this podcast, the wounds of a friend are faithful. So,
so naturally he had some
he had some wounds to provide us. That's right.
Us, yes.
So the one thing we did want to wrap up on, because we do know what is our audience here. It is teens and young adults, and we know that some of you parents out there, we appreciate you and you're listening with your kiddos, and we're thankful for you. And actually some people just randomly listening. Hey, we love you too. But our target audience here is teens and young adults. And so we do have some listeners who are young and they're newly married, even starting their own families. Some of them already have some young children. And sometimes some questions come out that we don't want to linger on this, but we think it's a worthwhile question, because we've both, I think all of us have heard it in various forms. How did things change when you've got your own household? You're a husband, you're a wife, and how do you honor your parents when you're not really under their authority anymore? And the one verse I wanted to read to set the stage for that, because I think it's so fundamental. In fact, if you were at the family weekend up in what was it, Wisconsin, in Mr. Sandor's area a couple years ago, I think I did a whole sermon on this. But in Genesis chapter 2, when God makes woman, and Adam says, like the word on the street version says, oh, now we're talking. And at the end of Genesis chapter 2, what does God say about this? He defines the family here. He says in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, therefore, and Christ quotes this in the New Testament, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. And the word leave there is actually very serious. It means a real cut. It means a real breaking of a certain kind of obligatory bond. It says, and therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Right there in verse 24, it's speaking of you are now a new household. There's a different relationship to authority now. That wife no longer looks to her parents to have authority in her life. She's looking to her husband that she has to respect. And the husband, he's very told, you leave father and mother. They no longer have that kind of authority, that commanding authority in your life. And I've known some young adults where that's kind of a question for them, because sometimes maybe mom and dad might have some advice that they're looking at their kids and, I think we want to do something different, but they struggle. Well, am I dishonoring my mom and dad, by not maybe taking their advice? And Mr. Sena, I know when we talked about this earlier before the podcast, you had some thoughts I really appreciated. Could you elaborate?
Yes, I think a couple of the scriptures that can be confusing in this context are Ephesians 6:1 and Colossians 3:20. Okay. Because specifically it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then it goes on to say in Ephesians 6, verse 2, honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And so the automatic connection you make between verse 1 and verse 2 is that children, obey your parents in the Lord is honoring them. Well, the clear context, going back to Ephesians 5, which starts with husbands, love your wives, and then what the wives to respect their husbands and everything. So the context is family. And so children here, though, are for young children who are under the control of the parents. They're guiding them. Okay. That is the role that the parents have in that phase of the child's life. And the children are expected to obey the parents in the Lord, for this is right. And part of what you're doing there when you're young and you're under their control, and then they're parenting you, is to honor your father and mother in that way. But honor itself isn't necessarily the same as obey. That's one aspect to it, but there are different phases in life where we are expected to do certain things. And the context here in Ephesians 6 is for children to obey their parents, as it is in Colossians 3 and verse 20, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. And once again, that's in the context of family. And so, though, when you become your own family, how you honor your parents changes, not necessarily in obeying what your parents tell you to do, because you've become your own family, your own unit, as you've brought out in Genesis 2, verse 24. You leave that unit and become your own, and become joined with your wife, cleave to your wife, and that then is starting your family unit separated from the family from which you came. And so, to me, don't confuse obey your parents with honor, because they aren't necessarily equal or the same thing. And there are different phases in our lives where God expects us to obey our parents in the Lord when we're children. But once you become your own unit in your own family, then you have to, by definition, being your own family, have to chart your own course, and then you have the responsibility when you have children to raise them, and they are expected to obey you. And so,
okay, right. So you're not telling our teenagers, you can honor your parents with it and still disobey them, but
right.
But eventually you are an adult and you run your own household, and you have. I think there's multiple biblical examples. One, Christ Himself says that his mere presence in the world will force some to have to decide to obey Him when their families don't, and He says that it'll divide fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, because you can't. Well, I've got to honor my father and not follow Christ. No, you've got to follow Christ. But one of my favorite examples is Solomon when he's talking to Bathsheba, and after David has died and Solomon is king, and Bathsheba, it's in 1 Kings 2, and Bathsheba comes on behalf of his brother Adonijah,
Solomon's brother.
Yeah, what did I say? Bathsheba's brother?
No,
Solomon's,
I just was clarifying.
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Half brother, but yeah, Solomon's, because Adonijah had previously plotted to take the throne, And God didn't want that. He wanted Solomon. Well, Adonijah, after mercy is extended to him, he goes to, he still wants the throne.
The queen mother.
That's right. So instead he goes to mom, right? Which, side note, isn't that what Roman Catholics often say? Oh, Jesus doesn't want to, go to Mary, anyway, just side note. Okay, distraction. Anyway, he goes to Bathsheba and he says, oh, could you ask Solomon for me? All I want is Abishag, the Shunammite, as a wife. And Abishag, of course, had been the young woman that was used to help keep David warm, when he was in bed. And it would have looked a certain way. Bathsheba's not picking up on it. And
is she?
I don't think she did. But she goes to Solomon and she says, "Oh, hey, son," and he honors her. If you read what it says when she comes to talk to him, he says, in fact, I'll read it in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 19. It says, Bathsheba therefore went to King Solomon to speak to him for Adonijah, and the king rose up to meet her. That's straight up Mr. Richard Ames, who says, you rise up before the hoary head. That's one way you show honor, is by standing when someone enters the room, and bowed down to her and sat down on his throne, and had a throne set for the king's mother. So she sat at his right hand. He went and fetched a fancy chair. Now, it's a subtle point. But notice he didn't get out of the throne and have her sit there. It's subtle, but it's important. But he did honor her. And as the king of Israel, he honored her. And then she says in verse 20, I desire one small petition of you. Don't refuse me. And the king said to her, ask it, my mother, for I will not refuse you. Now, that's another good example, because questions always exist in a context. And agreements like that, it's understood. Well, I'm assuming you're not going to ask go off and give the throne to some heathen Gentile or something, So he's clearly but anyway, he says, of course, mother, I whatever you ask, I want to do it. And so she drops it. Verse 21, let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah, your brother, as wife. In verse 22, in the woefully inaccurate version would say, well, of course I must honor my father and mother, and therefore you've asked it, so I've got to obey you and do. No, he saw right through that. And it says in verse 22, King Solomon answered and said to his mother, now why do you, I can't help but act it out a little bit. It's just great. Why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he's my older brother, for him and for Abiathar the priest and for Joab the son of Zeruiah. He saw just right through it. I love that moment.
He's like, that sounds like the Down with Solomon plan.
Yeah, it really does. But he realized he had other obligations. He's the king of Israel. He's got to do right by God. He's got to do all these things. And he didn't dishonor his mother. He showed her great honor. But it didn't change the fact that he, in a sense, not only ran a household. I mean, his household, in a sense, as the king, was all of Israel, and he led it responsibly. So, yeah, if you're a young man leading your family, and your mom or dad gives you advice, and you act on that advice, and because you don't want to decide yourself, and things turn out poorly, Christ doesn't let us as young husbands go, wow, God, I want to do different, but Dad said this, and it was like, well, your dad didn't marry your wife, you did. So, but that's not the same as there's that difference. You honor your parents, but the dynamic does change, and you're an adult now, and you're no longer a child who obeys. Now, hopefully you're still listening. They should be amongst your greatest advisors, right? But like he honored his mother, he wanted to hear what she had to say. She was clearly an honored advisor. But no, he still had to make the decision himself, and he did not dishonor her. He may not have obeyed her at that point, but he didn't dishonor her.
Back in the 90s when I listened to a lot of talk radio and I listened to the Dr. Laura Schlesinger show, I think I mentioned her before. If you put all of her calls, which you could, the calls always ended up being in like one of like maybe 5 categories. One of the most common ones was calls about meddlesome in-laws. It didn't always have to be in-laws, but just even parents. And it was a very, very common problem. And it's really parents that are, frankly, more struggling to reset the boundaries properly and honor their kids' new boundaries. And that's very common.
Well, one of the things I think is interesting about the Ephesians 6 and the Colossians 3 is that it includes that it's in the Lord. So the assumption, I take it to mean that these are people in the church or know God's truth. They're trying to follow God and everything, parents and children. And so definitely the parents also have an obligation to let go and honor what God tells their children once they become married, that they're their own family unit now. And yes, you can give advice, and especially if they ask and everything, but you should not expect that they need to obey
Right.
what you tell them to do, or what you advise, or something like that. Because, like Mr. Robinson said, a lot of problems, we've seen it in the ministry, come from parents not letting go and respecting that their children now are not under them necessarily to obey, but they can give advice, but the children, and especially the husband and the wife together, have to make the decision for their family.
Right. And so, like, if you have a daughter, respecting the fact that daughter is now married to a man and he is the head of her house, you are not, and not trying to kind of side door things or backdoor things, but respecting the fact that, that's literally why in a wedding ceremony, at least in most countries in the West, the father gives away the bride. That's not a meaningless symbol. It's profoundly meaningful. You are truly giving that woman away to this other man. So, wow, I think we've covered it pretty thoroughly. And first, let me say thank you, Mr. Sena.
Oh, you're welcome.
For spending your time with us.
Thank you for having me.
Always appreciate it. And let me tell all of our listeners, if you have any more profound questions about how to honor your parents, just contact Mr. Phil Sena. I know he'd be happy to help.
Thank you.
Smith and Robinson.